Brilliant. So we're live. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope that everyone is keeping well. And welcome to this evening's event on the Rights Removal Bill, which has been organized by the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking on the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. So we're very kindly joined today by three wonderful guests, one of whom is June Pang from Liberty, who will be chairing the discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to June to kick off.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much to Community Policy Forum and Kazim for having me. And I'll be chairing tonight's discussion, and we're hoping that it will be a good opportunity to learn a bit more about the Rights Removal Bill and the government's wider plans to rip up the Human Rights Act and kind of roll back some of the really crucial rights and protections that are so vital to individuals, communities across the UK. So I've been given the task of just setting some context about the Rights Removal Bill, and then I'll introduce myself and then the speakers who are joining me on the call tonight. So as some of you may already know, but also this is kind of an opportunity to kind of find out more, the Bill of Rights Bill, or also known and more widely known as the Rights Removal Bill, was introduced a few months ago, but kind of was preceded by a few government consultations and kind of independent reviews that the government set out essentially to repeal the existing Human Rights Act 1998 and replace it with a kind of inferior alternative that would have had really disastrous consequences, not only for kind of our legal system and our constitutional arrangements and devolution, and Mhairi will be able to speak to that. But crucially, of course, and of course, this is not, two different things, it would have had an incredibly devastating effect on the human rights of every single person in the UK and everyone's ability to hold power to account. And I'm sure we'll go into this in a bit more detail, but we've even had to kind of rejig this event because actually last Wednesday, a week past, we were very surprised by the news. Some people may not have been as surprised, but we definitely were, that the Bill of Rights Bill, Rights Removal Bill, would actually be shelved, which means that basically it will hopefully not return in its current form to Parliament to be debated. So that being said, and I think this will be part of the discussion tonight, we are not resting on our laurels, even though hundreds of civil society groups, including Community Policy Forum, worked really hard to try and resist the Rights Removal Bill. It's really important not to be complacent. And as we can see from the government's attacks on human rights in other areas, for example, in relation to protest or photographic voter ID or judicial review or kind of other attacks on rights, justice, and accountability, for example, through the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, and of course, like the entire task of trying to repeal the Human Rights Act and to justify it using such horrendous policies like the Rwanda plan that would have enabled that seeks to enable the removal of asylum seekers to Rwanda. The government is very intent on rolling back really vital protections, and of course, the harshest effects of this will be faced by already marginalized communities. really looking forward to discussing, how did we get here? What was so bad about the rights removal bill and what might still be in store for us? But also to hear a bit about kind of what we can do together to resist it and continue to oppose these really regressive and repressive developments and attacks on our rights. But yeah, that was a bit of context, but to clarify and to introduce myself, because I've just been talking at you, my name is June Pang, and I am a policy and campaigns officer at Liberty, which is a human rights organization in the UK. And we campaign for everyone in the UK to be treated fairly, with dignity and respect. And I'm joined tonight by two brilliant speakers. First, Professor Merris Amos. Merris is a professor of human rights law in the Department of Law at Queen Mary University of London and director of the Human Rights Law Centre. She is a UK member of the International Association of Constitutional Law and a member of the Executive Committee of the UK Constitutional Law Association. Her teaching and research concern the protection of human rights at the national level, in particular the Human Rights Act, and the relationship between national institutions and the European Court of Human Rights. She has published widely on these subjects, and her book, Human Rights Law 2021, is an important reference point for students, scholars, and legal practitioners. Our second speaker is Mhairi Snowden. Mhairi is Director of Human Rights Consortium Scotland, a civil society network of around 170 organizations concerned with the protection and realization of human rights in Scotland. With a background in policy around disabled people's rights and children's rights, Mhairi has recently been a member of the National Task Force that made recommendations for Scottish human rights law reform in Scotland, and it's involved in facilitating and coordinating the Scottish civil society response to the UK Bill of Rights. So yes, welcome Mhairi and Merris, and I guess I'll just start off, and for those who may be watching and listening in, who may not know the detail, and to be honest, even as someone who leads our work in this area, it's good to kind of learn about other people's perspective on this, but why are civil society so concerned about plans to repeal the Human Rights Act? And in particular, are there particular proposals in the rights removal bill that you found particularly concerning? Maybe I can go to Merris first.
Thanks, June. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, the Bill of Rights bill that's still before Parliament, but has been shelved, so it probably won't receive parliamentary time. There's a number of concerning aspects in the Bill of Rights bill. Usually, as the arc of history bends towards justice, has been said that a country's human rights protection improves. There's improvement at the international level always. But the Bill of Rights bill is a regression in rights protection, and quite a serious one, a very serious one. And as June said, it's actually quite hard to put into a short synopsis how many different ways that there's a reduction in rights protection, and it's actually incredibly technical as well. So I can give you an overview of some of the worst risks that arise from this bill. And for me, one of the greatest risks is that it will break the link between the UK and the European Court of Human Rights, to make it harder for UK courts to follow the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. And so that incredibly important dynamic source of change may be lost as a result. And it's a bill that, were it to come into force, would most likely result in the UK being found to be in breach of the convention, and perhaps eventually leave the convention system as a result. So there's that first danger, that breaking the link with European guarantees. A second really significant problem is it's going to decrease or lessen the remedies available when it's an act of Parliament that's that's breaching someone's human rights. So it's not going to be possible for judges to interpret acts of parliament, legislation as made by parliament consistently with human rights. That's no longer going to be possible as it is now, and lots of important things, like there's a really important protest case in the Supreme Court where they used that human rights remedy to give a remedy to the protesters, so they weren't convicted of obstruction of the highway. So those two things, increasing the power of the UK Parliament without regard to human rights, breaking the link with the European Court of Human Rights. And then there's lots of little things. They're keeping the substantive rights, the human rights that are in the Human Rights Act are going to remain the same. But this bill puts lots of glosses or restrictions on them. And so freedom of expression has an elevated or an important status, but not if you're a protester, for example. It's just going to have a regular status. But most concerning of all, I think, for the entire NGO community is the restriction on the development of positive human rights. So this bill is going to freeze human rights protection at the point that it passes into law. And there's a specific instruction that courts are not to develop any new positive human rights duties. And I find with my students often the positive human rights duties, what does that mean? I can give you lots of examples. It's requiring the state to actually do something to uphold human rights. So there's a really important series of cases in the European Court and in our courts about positive duties on police to effectively investigate crimes. And you may have heard of the successful litigation surrounding the black cab rapist John Warboys, and how the police didn't handle that particular investigation effectively, and some of the victims of that ineffective investigation succeeded in litigation in their cases, showing that the police had failed in that positive duty. So this bill, it's not going to remove that positive duty, but it's saying no more new positive duties. We're stopping now. And I'll finish on this point. My guess is the government is very concerned that the European Court of Human Rights, in a whole series of applications before it on climate justice, is going to find new positive duties concerned with climate action. And in particular, UK government is really concerned that that will filter through into human rights jurisprudence here. So thanks, June. That's not everything. That's just a starter.
No, thank you so much, Merris. That was really helpful in setting out, I think, what we at Liberty have kind of picked out as the kind of two angles to this attack, which is kind of on one hand, an attack on our institutions. So kind of our relationship with the European Court of Human Rights, and, you know, what you talked about in relation to like the living instrument, the fact that, you know, our human rights weren't designed. Our human rights were designed to keep up with the times and new technological developments, for example, and not to, you know, stay, you know, in the way that the text was written in the 50s. Because, you know, society changes, people like, you know, our society changes in really unpredictable ways that human rights are designed to adapt to, and the concerning implications of that for like protections in the UK. But also, of course, like focusing in on that individualized impact of that, and the positive obligations point is definitely really important. And I think in relation to the work of Community Policy Forum and people who work, you know, alongside the forum, I think it's worth foregrounding as well that obviously positive obligations in requiring the state to take certain actions to protect human rights it covers, an incredibly wide range of people, from enabling families to visit their loved ones during the COVID pandemic, under the right to respect for private and family life under Article 8, but also, as you say, like the duties on the state to investigate deaths in state custody, or kind of human rights abuses committed in state custody. And given what we know about institutional racism in the criminal justice system, and the fact that people of color, Muslim communities are disproportionately targeted, by these like punitive state institutions, eroding positive obligations is a really dangerous way of depriving people of the measure of justice that these mechanisms can enable them to achieve, which is not to say that they're perfect. And of course, no one is saying that the Human Rights Act is the one solution to all human rights abuses. Lots of people don't have access to justice in the first place. But in trying to radically overhaul it, or even replace it, repeal it, whatever, it's a really severe attack on all of us, but it's certain communities that will bear the brunt and feel the harshest effects. But I wanted to go to Mhairi, because I also think a key angle to this is the devolution angle, because obviously the Human Rights Act is important again to everyone, but it is also really interwoven with the devolved nations, and so it would be really useful to hear about the situation in Scotland, and also what your view is on the interaction between this and the kind of more progressive reforms that Scottish civil society have been advocating for a very long time.
Thanks, June. And it's really interesting being in this discussion at this point in time. I was just reflecting that point, Merris, that you made there about the direction of travel on human rights. I think is just so important that there is no way that we should be talking about how much they should be regressed, but actually the direction of travel should be more and further. What we hear from our member organisations across Scotland, and I know this is true of organisations across the UK, is that we completely dispute the UK government's kind of idea that human rights have gone too far, and actually human rights need to go even further. So we need more access to justice and not less. And we need human rights are not a luxury or something that's just nice to have or best practice. They are very, very minimal fundamental rights. Actually, if you ask most people, they would absolutely agree with that we all agree that everybody should be treated with dignity. And we all agree that actually there are minimum freedoms, that we don't want the government to be able to trample on minorities, that we want there always people to have an avenue to speak up on any abuses or infringements of rights that they experience. So I think actually the UK government have got that wrong. They've certainly got it wrong in terms of the public support for human rights in Scotland. It's what we find, it's increasing. And as people understand human rights more, it's only increasing even more, because actually we all agree with those fundamental principles. So I think that's one of the big messages of that Bill of Rights, but also all the other regressive elements that you were mentioning, June, is that it's just the wrong direction of travel when it comes to human rights. We all need more of our human rights protected and effective, not less. So that's certainly what we need to be pushing for. And I think one of the big concerns really of the Bill of Rights is that if someone experiences an infringement of their civil or political rights, they would have had less ability to do anything about it. So that it would have been more difficult to access justice and to hold the government to account. And at the same time, it would have ended up with public authorities, government authorities, not having to consider human rights as much as they once did. And given that human rights are, as I say, is not a luxury, they're really basic minimums, that's a real concern. So I think how glad we are that it's been shelved, but how much that overriding concern remains, that those sentiments and that rhetoric has not gone away, despite the fact that I think if you speak to a lot of the public and explain what it is, that they would be absolutely for keeping our human rights protections and strengthening them. That's what we found in Scotland. June, as you were mentioning, there is a much, at the moment, a really positive and progressive direction of travel on human rights, which has massive support from across civil society. Actually, when the Scottish Parliament was set up, the European Convention of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act are actually foundational to devolution. So it's right there embedded in the law that set up the Scottish Parliament. And what we've seen over the last 22 years is that becoming much more and more just the norm in terms of how things are just discussed. So it's not whether or not to take human rights into account, but actually a genuine discussion, debate about what that would look like and sort of wrestling with that. Not that by any means we've got there, but that is, it's baked in terms of devolution. And so the Bill of Rights really threatens that and threatened the way the law works in Scotland. But alongside that, we have had for a number of years now a debate around actually putting all of our international human rights directly into law. So the Human Rights Act, because it incorporates the ECHR, that is basically a kind of one big chunk of our human rights in terms of civil and political rights. So kind of the freedoms, the right to life, right to fair trial, and the other big chunk that apply to everyone is our economic, social and cultural rights. So things like the right to food, the right to health, the right to social security, the sort of basics. And so the direction of travel in Scotland is to put those rights as well into Scots law. So it wouldn't apply to reserve things. It wouldn't. There's quite significant bits that it won't apply to because it can only be in devolved law. But nonetheless, devolved law is things like the NHS, education, justice, police are all within that. So it's a quite ambitious and it's challenging, but that's the way we should be going. You know, we should be making human rights more real for more of us and making sure that minorities and minorities within minorities are protected through our human rights law and have more avenues for the voice to be heard, which is why the Bill of Rights was such a concern, I think.
Thanks so much, Mhairi. And absolutely, I mean, I think, you know, we're all, and this is the kind of, you know, the real quandary, I guess. Well, I guess it's not a quandary, but there are many things that are facing people at the moment where, you know, we have a concurrent cost of living or cost of greed crisis. You know, trade unions and workers are mobilizing in favor of better conditions. The climate crisis is going to continue to have drastic effects for so many people around the world, but also in the UK. And you just have to think, like, you know, at a time when we're facing these multiple concurrent crises, and there's also wider national conversations happening about the role of the police and how can we imagine, you know, a more just and fair system for people to live more dignified lives. You would think that there might be other things for those in power to preoccupy themselves with, but yeah, evidently that is not the trajectory and direction of travel. And I was just wanting to pick up, I guess, like from just like, I think the outline of the issues that you've both given with the Rights Removal Bill and more generally with the government's plans in respect to the Human Rights Act are really helpful. And the one thing, and I just wanted to add, is kind of the way in which the Rights Removal Bill and the government's entire approach to human rights more generally, because I think it's kind of more general than just in relation to this bill, although of course this bill is, and any substitute bill that then arrives is the epicenter of it. But in this government, we see a real attempt to erode the universality of human rights and to try and mark out certain people as undeserving, less deserving of human rights on the basis of such things as their migration status or the fact that they've, had been previously given custodial sentences. And kind of in the bill itself, you see direct references and direct provisions that would have locked, in particular, people with custodial sentences from challenging certain violations of their human rights. And again, like just picking up on what I was saying earlier, given like institutional racism in the criminal justice system, this would have disproportionately severely affected like Black communities in particular, Muslim communities, and of course, like Maslaha have done a really great report on the experiences of Muslim prisoners in having their rights routinely violated already. And so this would have just locked people out of challenging those even further. Also, like it's worth flagging, the bill would have enabled the government to pass more restrictive deportation, more restrictive laws for people seeking to challenge their deportations on the basis of private and family life, which, off the back of the horrendous anti-refugee bill, Nationality and Borders bill, would further erode these people's ability to challenge decisions that will tear them away from their families and their communities in a really horrendous and drastic way, and also in a way that really goes against the rule of law, because there are provisions about limiting people's ability to challenge deportations on the basis of, I think, right to a fair trial. So, more details about this can be found in like various organizations' briefings, and I'd really recommend looking at Bail for Immigration Detainees, Detention Action, JCWI's work in this particular area on migrants' rights. But of course, and this is also related to immigration and asylum and universality, is that, and it's worth noting that there is no evidence base for the proposals in the rights removal bill, and the government just basically ignored the independent panel it commissioned to produce recommendations, as well as a consultation that it then ran that received, I think, more than 12,000 submissions to. But the bill also explicitly says that basically the courts would have to ignore interim measures, which are basically the measure that basically grounded the first removal flight to Rwanda of asylum seekers a few months ago. And of course, Detention Action, PCS, and Asylum Aid are challenging the Rwanda plan, and Freedom from Torture, are challenging the Rwanda plan. And I think a result on that is coming in mid-October. But, in not only in the substance, but in the rhetoric run through all of these horrendous measures is just this really concerning and not without precedent, but kind of drastic attempt to cordon off rights as something that's, as Mhairi said, kind of a perk or a privilege of living in our society, which is just not true, goes against the history of it post-World War II, and is really dangerous because, again, once you give the government the power to move the goalposts, as we know, more and more people will fall under that umbrella, and but we should just reject it in principle, because that's not how we want our society to be, and we want to live in a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So I think and there are other measures in there, like so many measures in there that are so bad. But yeah, I don't know, Mhairi, if you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just want to come in and agree. I think that was one of the biggest concerns of that Bill of Rights bill, and actually it's been a bit of concern across lots of different bills, is that challenging the fact that actually human rights are for all of us and must be protected equally for all of us, and should not depend on who we are, what we look like, what we've done, or circumstances. So I mean, I think one of the big challenges for those of us who work in civil society or are interested in this area in the coming weeks and months is to actually speak up wherever human rights look to be regressed for any group in any circumstance, because it is so fundamental that unless human rights are protected for all of us, they're really not protected for any of us. So we need to actually all speak up on that and work towards that principle, including, for example, one of the most significant impacts of the Human Rights Act in Scotland was to improve prisons. And I don't say that lightly, because people don't, you know, yes, human rights are also for those in prisons. We had actually medieval conditions in Scottish prisons. They were awful until the Human Rights Act was in place, and then a case could be taken, and then only then were the prison conditions were improved, and people knew they should have been improved for years. It took the Human Rights Act actually to get that change happen, and that's quite right, because human rights apply to people in prison as well. They apply to people who have been in prison, they apply to people no matter where they were born, and they also apply when people are at risk of deportation. Just to flag up that actually minimising or discounting the right to private and family life in deportation cases, that's an infringement of human rights. It's also infringement of often of children's rights, who it is their parent is being taken away, and that is completely unacceptable. So I think for these next weeks and months, when we wait to see what the UK government will do next, the Bill of Rights, but also other legislation, it's that all speaking up wherever human rights is challenged for any particular group. And emphasising that they must apply equally to all of us.
Thank you so much, Mhairi. And yeah, absolutely. And I think I would just flag, I think it was yesterday even, Public Law Project won a really brilliant case for their client, which basically found that the court found, using the Human Rights Act, that denying bereavement support payment to surviving families of people who could not work because of lifelong disability is a breach of human rights. And kind of using a combination of, the human rights and the Human Rights Act, which requires the courts to read legislation compatibly with human rights, but also the human right to, I think it was, about the right to private and family life and against discrimination, that this result was achieved for this particular person and this client, but and I think this is what, Mhairi, you touched on as well, but also to achieve like positive change beyond that. And I think that's the part of the Human Rights Act that is often missed out, is that most cases where the Human Rights Act has actually succeeded in its function of protecting human rights never get to the courts. And so it's actually, the everyday actions that public bodies do, transformed by the Human Rights Act. And of course, public bodies still have a ways to go, like not every public body always respects human rights, but in the everyday interactions that, an NHS worker or a person working in care or supporting someone, every decision that they make that's informed by human rights, ushered in by the Human Rights Act, is the success of the Human Rights Act, and every person supported and who is able to live a dignified life as a result of that is a success of the Human Rights Act. And it doesn't take, a court case to show that. And in so many instances, it doesn't even amount to that. And of course, the court cases are also important, but yeah, repealing the Human Rights Act has such, I would say, untrammeled effects. And to be honest, the government didn't really, in its impact assessments, really go into detail or elaborate about really the implications of its proposals on anyone, but also did not do an Equality Act assessment on its consultation either. So we wouldn't. They don't even know like the impact that it will have. But yeah.
I was going to mention
Merris.
during the one thing I haven't mentioned is the process that led to the bill, and you've mentioned a few of the things. I mean, that's really shocking just in itself, because it's to take away human rights is one thing, but to not even ask people in advance. We were meant to live in a democracy, and so the Conservative government was elected with its manifesto promise to update the Human Rights Act and to establish a commission to look into the Human Rights Act. And it kind of did all that. It set up a body that had a very limited scope and had very limited powers. And then it ignored the findings of that body, just completely ignored them. This actually a very good report, essentially recommending no change on the same day the government released its own consultation paper, ignoring that report. And you were talking about evidence base. This consultation paper had absolutely no evidence base. It's 100 pages long, and it was full of misleading statements not based in evidence, ignoring the realities, and focusing a lot, as you say, June, on the groups that are seen to be unpopular with the average voter, the immigrants, asylum seekers, prisoners, and welfare recipients, and also, not to forget, the victims of violations of human rights violations by UK armed forces overseas. That's been a really big part of this as well. And so there was legislation which was a kind of warm-up to this that's actually passed, the Overseas Operations Bill, no, Overseas Operations Act, sorry. So yes, they had a consultation paper not based in evidence. They received, I think, did you say 12,000 submissions to that? And then in their response to the consultation, they said, well, 90% said, no, don't change this, but we're going to change it anyway because we're not convinced of the reasons for that. And the impact statement was also not based in evidence. And the bill changing a really fundamental aspect of our society and our constitution is introduced to Parliament. That's the kind of thing you shouldn't see in a liberal democracy. I think that's just really, really shocking. So the process itself, and imagine if that process was applied to something else, something that has implications, wider implications. It's difficult to imagine. Maybe what could it be? It could be a drastic reduction on freedom of expression, a new bill, a consultation process is all follows a similar path. And so that process is really worrying, I think.
Absolutely. And yeah, of course, I think the overseas operations that we haven't even managed to go into that, but essentially those were proposals that the government, as you mentioned, Merris, has been trying to pursue to basically prevent the Ministry of Defense, but also from being held to account, basically, for violating human rights of civilians, of civilians abroad, but also like British soldiers abroad or in overseas military operations. And I would flag the Center for Military Justice for great, amazing, and really harrowing stories of how soldiers have used the Human Rights Act to fight for their rights, and also the organization Ceasefire for the other perspective on how civilians, for example, Iraqi families have used the Human Rights Act to try and hold British forces to account. but yeah, and also just on the process, like, I think that's such a good point. And the other thing to add is that the consultation, they didn't publish an easy read or audio version of the consultation until I think it was a day before the deadline, and only after hundreds of disabled people-led organizations, NGOs, wrote to the Justice Secretary, and also threatened legal action, and also wrote to the Joint Committee on Human Rights that they can't go, like, they can't, that the proposal would have such a disproportionate and detrimental effect for disabled people. And yet they just completely locked it off for disabled people who, or anyone who needs those resources to respond, and then only gave half the time that everyone else got to people who needed those resources to respond. And then, of course, after 4 parliamentary committees wrote to the Justice Secretary saying that the legislation should at least go through a period of what we call pre-legislative scrutiny, so that a draft bill would be published before it's introduced to Parliament, that, you know, we can have more time to consider its effects. This was denied because they were like, it's fine, we don't need to scrutinize this more. And then, yeah, I just obviously flagging as well, like this, again, this consultation that had such significant ramifications that we were all just trying to guess at that point, had one catch-all question that was about what might the effect of this be for the devolved nations, and just completely glossing over the different legal systems, traditions. And I should mention in particular, in solidarity with like colleagues in Northern Ireland, that this could have had really detrimental effects, in particular for peace in Northern Ireland, given how deeply embedded the Human Rights Act and rights protections under the ECHR are to that, the Good Friday Agreement. It's just
to come in there. I think that is incredibly important, actually, that it risked peace in Northern Ireland by destabilising what is the foundation of the Good Friday Agreement, is the Human Rights Act, and it was taken so lightly. That is a really big concern. And also the Scottish government and the Welsh government both says, well, it is going to have huge consequences. I think that just goes together with all of those consultation responses, all of what the government was hearing from the Joint Committee on Human Rights, by experts across the field, and not just by kind of legal experts. We're talking about people in communities, who in grassroots, who every day the Human Rights Act, in a really basic way, was providing protection. It protects all of us, actually, even in ways we don't really realise, because it's just in the background working away, making sure that policy and law protects those basic rights. So to ignore all of that, I think it is a massive concern as well. So I think you're right. It's both what the bill kind of says, the message it sends, the detail of it in terms of the impact it would have, but also about the process of how on earth we got there is a real concern. And I think for all of us who work in the civil society, we need to be on that, saying, actually, you know, all of these processes and consultations and things, they've got to mean something. You know, you don't just go through the process and then it's just binned. You know, that sounds like taking time and giving kind of views and concerns from our kind of experience that absolutely should be taken into account by government if they're doing a good job, you know, and being sensible. Just say, I think as well, in some ways, I think to a certain extent we shouldn't be surprised that there's such a challenge to human rights, because they are actually inconvenient sometimes for government. They do challenge them, and they do, you know, they have to take them into account. They can restrict them in some ways, because it means that government can't just do whatever. It's got to be within the parameters of human rights. So in some ways we shouldn't be surprised at the challenge to human rights, but at the same time, human rights actually make government decisions better. You know, they make them better because they have a framework and a very practical way to make them work for everybody, and to take into account all the different kind of experiences and views. Even if things end up in court, it can make it better, because unintended consequences and things can be understood. So, for example, just thinking about sorry, there's a siren outside. Just thinking about the cases around the bedroom tax, for example. And actually there were like consequences for disabled people who needed a spare bedroom for carers to be in. Well, that's an unintended consequence, really. No one really. So it actually makes decisions better if they're embraced. It could be inconvenient, but actually it makes for better law, better policy, and better protection of those really basic minimums.
Absolutely. I'm going to move us on a little bit and reflect a bit on the shelving announcement. So just to get everyone up to speed, again, like I said in the beginning, last Wednesday, we basically heard that the rights removal bill in its current iteration would be shelved. And obviously now we have the mourning period, which means that Parliament isn't sitting. And so we have a bit of a period of just where things are a bit up in the air and we're not sure what's going to happen next. But I think it's important to contextualize this in that obviously this is not, the new Prime Minister and her new cabinet are not friends of human rights. I think that is fair to say. And, in particular, the new Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has said, within her first few days of being made Home Secretary, has already doubled down on the commitment to make the Rwanda plan, for example, work. And it looks very clear that she is going to escalate attacks on refugees and migrants. And of course, the new Justice Secretary, Brandon Lewis, was famously the one who said that the Northern Ireland Protocol was a breach of international law, but it was fine because it was very narrow and specific. And the trajectory generally of the UK government is that is towards rights regression rather than rights progression, I would say. So, there are a few options for how the bill could come back. And at Liberty, we've been thinking a bit about, with other civil society groups, what could happen. And, we could see the Bill of Rights. We could see the rights removal bill come back in the same form, even. That's within the realm of possibility. They could try and tinker with it. They could try and introduce, like in the last legislative session, multiple pieces of legislation to do a kind of death by 1,000 cuts approach to the Bill of Rights, to the Human Rights Act, targeting certain communities and trying to basically achieve the same effects, but through different means. And perhaps most drastic of all, and as we heard during the Conservative Party leadership election, there might even be, gestures towards leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, which of course the Human Rights Act incorporates into our domestic law. Now, the new Prime Minister has previously said on record that this is not the end game, but obviously the Home Secretary has said that, multiple people have said that all options are on the table, and so, there is real concern. There is real reason for concern. And so I just wanted to kind of have a discussion about basically that option, the kind of almost like the kind of effects of that. And I wanted to go to Merris because obviously you're an expert in that, but also Mhairi because of, again, like how integral the ECHR is to all of our rights protections, but also the wider constitutional condition of the UK. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen next. I think that bill is. My guess is that's not going to make it through any parliamentary stages. It won't be given parliamentary time. It's been appreciated that it is unenforceable. It's the language of the bill. I mean, judges would be met with the most horrendous interpretive difficulties, and also that's been appreciated that given it wasn't in the election manifesto, it's not going to be passed by the House of Lords, and so it would be a nightmare to try and get that bill through Parliament. So I've got absolutely no real insight into this. All I can guess is from years of experience what might happen. It was also very much the pet project of the former Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, so it was a kind of personality issue as well, and it was his. It's actually been in a drawer somewhere for 5 years, and then it was produced. And so without his drive and ambition, it's going to also suffer. There's politics, as we've also mentioned. People are concerned about lots of other things. And we know modern government is always polling and looking at what people are interested in. People are interested in being able to pay their bills, being able to live a decent life with dignity. They're not really interested in some kind of bizarre 40-page Bill of Rights at the moment. But the biggest danger, June, I think, is they realised it wasn't fit for purpose, because the UK would still be a contracting state, would still be part of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights. And so no matter what happened in the national context, there would be a risk that the European Court would find against the UK. And the only way that that can be solved or seen as a problem is for the UK to leave the ECHR first. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's the very simple plan that is presented. And it's not necessary for an act of Parliament for that to happen. We could say it would be good practice for there to be an act of Parliament to leave the ECHR, but it's not necessary. So that's my guess as to what's coming next.
Thanks so much, Merris. And yeah, I think that's an incredibly worrying prospect to be confronted with, but one that we need to be like very vigilant to. Mhairi, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely alarming, and I think even the fact that we're discussing this, there was all questions about the UK's international reputation as a country that takes human rights seriously, and what it says to other countries as well in terms of how they should take human rights seriously. So I think, to be honest, I think the UK government will think carefully about that, because surely they don't want that huge damage to the UK's international reputation at all. Is not a good thing. But back to the point that actually we kind of almost started with, the impact in terms of access to justice and accountability for individuals and communities would be really significant. And again, in Scotland, it's particularly significant because it's right there in the middle of devolution. So it's extremely difficult to untangle, to be honest, to sort of go. So I think these next few weeks and months, for those of us who care about human rights, it is an opportunity and a challenge to increase the public support for human rights. And I say public in terms of civil society, but actually organisations and community groups and individuals speaking very publicly about their support for human rights and human rights for everybody. So I think that's an opportunity to say that loud and clear, so that without a doubt the UK government know that there is no support for any more going backwards. And I think if there's anything that's a bit of a ray opening to this, is actually the number of civil society organisations working really well together in partnership to head off this regressive Bill of Rights has been quite remarkable, and something we need to build on. So actually across the UK there's loads of different interests and different groups and different organisations all coming together to say no, this should not happen. We shouldn't have such regressive human rights law at all for anyone, and instead the direction of travel should be more human rights protected for more people.
Thank you so much, Mhairi. And that actually leads me very well into my last question as chair before I hand back to Kazim, because we are almost at time. But I guess I just wanted to finish with a question, which is basically, what, in your view, in like 2 sentences, should we be doing in light of all of this? And that can be like from an individual level or a civil society level or whatever level. And I can start because I have asked this question to give you some more time to think. But of course, and my Liberty colleagues would kill me if I didn't say this, but at Liberty, we are campaigning really hard with and alongside civil society groups, of which there are around, hundreds and hundreds more in the UK, to resist all of these attacks on our human rights. And so if you want to find out more, you can join Liberty as a member for as little as £1 a month. But also you can follow us on social media, and we produce resources on, emailing your MP and signing petitions, any little bit of action that raises the alarm that these attacks on our rights are happening, but also that, we as people who care about these things and want to take action can achieve change. And just quickly, I want to also shout out the work of other organizations like the British Institute of Human Rights, who do a lot of training for public bodies on how to protect human rights, but also have been doing lots of really vital resources, including easy read resources in collaboration with people with lived experience of using the Human Rights Act. And you can look at their resources online as well. And the second thing is more general, but I think, and this will not be new material to the people watching, I assume, but it's just like, emphasizing to each other, to your neighbors, writing to your MP, parliamentarians, that A, the Human Rights Act protects all of us, and B, when we say all of us, we mean all of us. And universality of human rights is not something that we can take for granted, and indeed it's an aspirational goal, because we can always improve access to justice, but the ways that this government is targeting certain communities is racist, it's cruel, and fundamentally just oppressive on so many levels, and completely undermines and upturns the logic of human rights in such an egregious way that we can all resist it, no matter what form the future attacks may take. So I will go to, I don't know if Mhairi or Merris, either one of you want to go.
I think you said everything.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think I can't think of anything I would add. I would say write to your MP, collect evidence. Like, what's the value of human rights? They're really valuable on the ground examples are really important to just make it relatable to the average person. This could affect your kids, but think about them, think about what they're doing and how human rights law could be important.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you support human rights, there is a time to be public about that and be quite active and demonstrate your support however you can, even on Twitter.
Great, amazing. And also I should say that on Twitter, where a lot of us are using the hashtag rights removal bill, hashtag save your rights, and also Liberty, sorry to plug Liberty again, but we have something called a Twitter community, which my comms colleagues recently amazingly produced, which I did not know existed, essentially a Facebook group, but on Twitter, that you can join for free to just chat about human rights with other like-minded people. But yeah, thank you again to Community Policy Forum for giving us the space to discuss this. And I hope anyone watching found this useful. And you can always reach me on Twitter or on email if you have any questions. But I'll go back to Kazim. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, June. And on behalf of the Community Policy Forum, I'd like to thank each and every one of you once again for taking time out to join this evening, particularly considering the circumstances in the UK at the moment, So June, Mhairi, Merris as well. And thank you ever so much for your insights. And I'm sure this discussion could be continued a lot further than the hour that we spent. And there is certainly a lot more ground to cover. And just echoing what June said, certainly like organizations like Liberty, BIHR, Human Rights Consortium Scotland, do follow them on social media, make your voices heard, engage. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you're probably watching this event on right now. Also follow us on Twitter at Policy Community, as well as on LinkedIn to stay updated about our work. And for further information about our work and about the organization in general, please visit communitypolicyforum.com. Thank you everyone for listening. Take care of yourselves. And thank you again to all of our